On the first morning of June, 1879, on a riverbank in a foreign kingdom called Zululand, search parties found a young man's body lying naked in tall grass, his skin marked by 17 spear wounds, a small gold medal of the Virgin Mary still knotted around his throat. He was 23 years old. He had once been called the most important child alive. Rewind 23 years. A palace in Paris. A 101-gun salute rolling out over rooftops. Church bells ringing until the ringer's arms gave out. An emperor lifting his newborn son above a screaming crowd. A son born to inherit a throne, a name, and an empire that stretched, in the minds of those who cheered him, toward forever. How does the only son of an empress, a boy raised from infancy to rule an empire, end up speared to death on an errand that was never his war, in a country his family had never governed, fighting for a crown that was not even France's own? In the next few minutes, you will discover what was found knotted around a dead prince's neck. You will learn the name Jahleel Carey, the officer who rode away and lived, and you will follow his mother 7,000 miles to a hillside in Zululand, where she planted a willow cut from the island where the first Napoleon died. What you are about to hear is not a story about the fall of an empire. It is a story about a mother who spent the last 41 years of her life building a resting place for a son who was never allowed, from the moment of his birth, to simply be a boy. What you are about to hear has not been told this way before. Stay with it. He was born just after 3 in the morning on the 16th of March, 1856, at the Tuileries Palace, after a labour so violent that his mother's screams reportedly carried through the corridors, and so damaging that doctors were forced to choose, with forceps in hand, between saving the mother or the child. Napoleon III did not hesitate. Save the Empress. Eugénie survived. So, against the odds of that brutal delivery, did the boy. He was named Napoléon Eugène Louis-Jean-Joseph Bonaparte. The nation did not wait for him to grow into the title Prince Imperial before it began building him into a symbol. A 101-gun salute sounded across France the moment his birth was confirmed. Cannons in Algiers and in the French colonies echoed it hours later. The Pope agreed to stand as his godfather, by proxy, at a christening before 6,000 guests in Notre Dame, where the infant, nicknamed Lulu, reportedly slept through the entire ceremony, while a diamond-crowned mother carried him past the crowd, privately terrified of dropping him. The boy was strapped onto a pony's saddle before he could walk with confidence. Before his first birthday was through, he had been ceremonially enrolled in the Grenadiers of the Guard and posed in miniature uniform for an official portrait meant to reassure a nation that its heir was already, symbolically, a soldier. By the age of 3, he stood beside his father at military reviews, small and solemn, learning before he could read that his body in public was never entirely his own. Here is the detail that mattered more than any of the parades. From somewhere in that gilded, overmanaged childhood, the exact moment was never recorded, and that omission is itself a kind of confession about how little privacy the boy was permitted. Someone placed a small gold medal of the Virgin Mary on a chain around his neck, alongside an old seal that had belonged to his great-uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte. He wore it every day of his life after that, not for ceremony, not for photographs, underneath the uniforms, underneath the sashes, against his own skin. His mother adored him with an intensity his own doctor found excessive. She refused to leave his bedside during illness, and according to the physician's private notes, expected a 4-month-old infant to behave like one 3 times his age. His father, by contrast, could not bear to discipline him at all. When the boy was caught playing in the emperor's private office and Eugénie moved to punish him, Napoleon simply waved her off. Let him be. He'll have enough discipline later. He would. Discipline, in the end, is not the word history remembers. Sacrifice is. Before there was a son, there had to be an empire worth inheriting, and an empress willing to build one. Eugénie de Montijo, a Spanish countess with red hair, a taste for bullfights, and a habit of nearly drowning herself in Atlantic storms as a girl, married Napoleon III on the 30th of January, 1853, in a ceremony at Notre Dame, so lavish that European courts spent months debating whether a mere countess, however grand her Spanish titles, was fit to sit beside an emperor. Legend holds that when Napoleon first asked her the way to her heart, she answered coolly, "Through the chapel, sire." She meant it. She got her chapel wedding, her crown, and, within 3 years, her son. Together, the imperial couple built a version of Paris that still exists. They financed Baron Haussmann's boulevards, though Eugénie despised the Baron personally, calling him a bureaucratic brute who dismissed her ideas as meddling. She built her own answer to his cold modernization, a girls' school for 300 destitute children in a working-class district he had ignored, funded in part by pledging away 600,000 francs of her own wedding gift diamonds. She opened a children's hospital. She planted, with her husband, more than 600,000 trees across the capital in 17 years, a record no city has matched since. At the height of it, the numbers alone tell the story of what the family had built. A jewellery collection valued, at the time, at 3,600,000 francs. A summer villa on the Basque coast that transformed a fishing village named Biarritz into a resort where European royalty spent every August. A court where a single Englishman named Charles Frederick Worth, discovered through a chance encounter at a Christmas ball, became the first designer in history to dress an empress and, through her patronage, invent the very idea of haute couture. Everything a 19th-century monarchy could offer a child, this boy was given before he could speak in full sentences. And yet, even at the summit, one detail sat quietly beneath the gold. The emperor's health, even in these glittering years, was already failing in ways the public was not told. Within 14 years, the empire that had thrown a 101-gun salute for this child's birth would not exist. Within 23, neither would he. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about the household this boy grew up inside. Nearly everyone in it was keeping something from someone else, and the boy absorbed the habit of secrecy before he understood what it cost. His father's hidden life was the least hidden of all. Napoleon III was, by his own cheerful admission, a man rarely capable of fidelity, telling one confidant that usually it is the man who attacks, and I defend myself, and I often capitulate. His most visible mistress, a former actress named Harriet Howard, had once scandalized the imperial family simply by attending official functions. After the brutal, near-fatal delivery of his only son, the emperor and empress never shared a bed again. Doctors had warned that a second pregnancy could kill her. Napoleon returned, quietly and immediately, to his old habits. Eugénie's private life was harder to read, and later historians, mostly male, mostly writing decades after her death, dismissed her as cold, frigid, or simply too ambitious for intimacy. The more accurate account, drawn from her own letters and the observations of people who knew her, describes a woman who adored the theatre of courtship, the letters, the pursuit, but who seemed to feel little pull toward its physical conclusion. Whatever the precise shape of that truth, one fact is not in dispute. A marriage that had begun in genuine, almost girlish infatuation became, within a few years, something closer to a well-run diplomatic partnership than a romance. The son inherited a household built on that gap. He was raised, simultaneously, by a father who could not bear to discipline him and a mother who could not bear to let him out of her sight, and by an English governess, Miss Jane Shaw, personally selected by Queen Victoria, who would remain with him for the rest of his life, and who, in some ways, understood him better than either parent did. There is a piece of evidence for what this cost him that the public never saw. The boy's own tutor, Augustin Filon, recorded that the prince once terrified the household by crawling along a second-story balcony ledge, shuffling window to window above open air, apparently simply to see if he could. A small act of private defiance from a child who was rarely, in public, permitted to be anything other than perfect. What his parents did not know, could not have known, watching him ride ponies and pose for court portraits, was that the very qualities being cultivated in him for the throne were the same qualities that would, one day, get him killed on a riverbank on the other side of the world. By 1860, Eugénie had already lost her father to sudden illness at 13 years old, watched a suicide attempt of her own fail after a broken engagement, and buried a great deal of the softness her childhood tutors once described. But nothing prepared her for the 18th of September 1860. She was in Algiers that day, about to inaugurate a boulevard named, with unintended irony, after herself. A telegram arrived. Her older sister, Paca, Duchess of Alba, was gravely ill with tuberculosis back in Spain. Eugénie cancelled the remainder of an imperial tour on the spot and set out through a violent Mediterranean storm to reach her. Here is the detail official French court records never fully explained, and that most biographies still gloss past. Napoleon, fearing the political disruption of an empress in open grief mid-tour, deliberately withheld the worst of the incoming telegrams from his wife during the journey home. Paca died while Eugénie was still at sea. She did not learn the truth, that her sister was already gone, that there would be no farewell, no funeral she could reach in time, until she had returned to French soil. You need to sit with what that means for a moment. A woman who had spent her entire adult life inside a machine of pageantry and protocol, who was rarely permitted an unscripted feeling in public, learned of her only sister's death second-hand, after the fact, because the men around her had decided that her grief was a liability to be managed rather than a truth to be told. She fled almost immediately to Scotland, convinced by her own persistent cough that she shared her sister's fate. She would not learn otherwise for 5 more weeks. She never forgave the timing of that telegram, though she rarely spoke of it directly again. She ordered the Alba family home in Madrid demolished, rather than walk its empty rooms. I told you about a gold medal knotted around a dead prince's neck 23 years before this story reaches him. I will return to it. For now, understand only this. The woman who would one day receive news of her own son's death, filtered and managed and arriving too late for any real goodbye, had already lived through exactly that same shape of loss once before, in 1860, on a ship in a storm, and had never spoken of how much it frightened her. Here is what no popular retelling of Eugénie's story has ever fully explained. The years after Paca's death did not soften her. They hardened her into something closer to a governing partner than a decorative consort, and it was precisely that hardening that would, 18 years later, make her incapable of simply keeping her son at home. Privately, in the 1860s, Eugénie began functioning as something the Archbishop of Paris himself called a charitable ministry, a personal, largely self-funded department of the French state, overseeing maternal health societies, orphanages, daycare centres, and rehabilitation programs for disabled war veterans. She took out a life insurance policy on herself, worth 2.5 million francs, specifically to guarantee these programs would outlive her. Few of her contemporaries, and fewer of her critics in the press, understood how much real administrative power she had accumulated behind the ceremony. That same appetite for consequence, for being useful rather than merely present, she poured directly into her son's education. She demanded a curriculum for him far beyond horsemanship and military drill, philosophy, languages, moral instruction, over the objections of advisers who felt a future emperor needed little more than a sabre and a steady seat on a horse. Philon, his tutor, described the boy as energetic and defiant, prone to giving away his spare coins to beggars, just as his mother had done as a girl in Andalusia, but never permitted to actually understand poverty firsthand. Palace security officials repeatedly blocked Eugénie's attempts to bring him along on her visits to the poor. The household staff at the Tuileries later described a pattern that never made the official chronicles. A boy who idolized stories of his great-uncle's battlefield glory more than any actual lesson in governance, who kept, from a very young age, a private fascination with soldiering that no tutor had planted and no parent had discouraged strongly enough to matter. By 1870, when France went to war with Prussia, that fascination would no longer be a private amusement confined to toy soldiers and parade ground reviews. It would put a 14-year-old boy on an actual battlefield beside his ailing father, and it would plant, in the mind of the last Bonaparte heir, an idea his mother would spend the rest of her life failing to talk him out of, that a Bonaparte's worth was measured only in the willingness to die for it. The second collapse came fast, and it came for everything at once. France declared war on Prussia in July of 1870, walking, diplomats now largely agree, directly into a trap set by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck through a deliberately provoked and edited telegram. Napoleon III, frail, addicted to opium for the pain of an undiagnosed bladder stone, insisted on personally leading the army anyway, taking his 14-year-old son to the front and naming Eugénie regent in his absence. This was not the first time Eugénie had governed France alone. But it was different in one crucial way. This time, there was no empire left to protect by the time she was finished. Through August, the telegrams from the front grew steadily worse. Defeats at Forbach, at Froschwiller, French soldiers in bright red trousers, cut down by Prussian artillery that outranged anything France could answer. On the 1st of September, at Sedan, more than 100,000 French soldiers were surrounded and pounded by what a Prussian officer called a circle of fire. Napoleon, in full uniform, rode into that fire for 5 hours hoping to die with his men. He survived. He surrendered his sword to the Prussian king instead. When word reached Eugénie in Paris, she did not weep. According to those present, she screamed at her husband's own aid. An emperor does not capitulate. He is dead. They are trying to hide it from me. Why didn't he kill himself? Doesn't he know he has dishonored himself? Her secretary later described the palace in that hour as looking like the ruins after an earthquake. Within days, mobs surrounded the Tuileries, demanding the Bonapartes be overthrown. Eugénie refused to summon troops to fire on her own people, fled through a locked Louvre passage, a loyal servant unlocked just in time, and eventually found sanctuary with an old friend, her American dentist, Dr. Thomas Evans, the same man who years earlier had let a stranger take his own appointment because a young Spanish countess insisted the man in pain be seen first. Evans smuggled her by carriage and then by yacht to England. She arrived, an empress with no empire, on the Isle of Wight, on the 7th of September, 1870. She had made a decision the world did not yet understand as a mistake. She had let her only child march, at 14, into the first war of his life. It would not be his last. The scandal, when it came, was not a love affair or a leaked letter. It was worse, because it could not be denied, apologized for, or spun. It was a nation's collapse, laid publicly at the feet of a woman the press had already decided to despise. The trigger was public, documented, and immediate. The empire's total defeat, followed almost overnight by a French Republic declared in Paris, while the imperial family scattered into exile. Contemporary newspapers, both French and British, seized on the ugliest available narrative. Eugénie, Spanish-born, foreign, a woman who had reportedly pushed her husband toward the war by pointing at their son and declaring the boy would never reign unless the humiliations of past wars were repaired, was recast almost overnight as the empire's true author of ruin. The insult that had once been meant to mock her, fashion plate, curdled into something crueler. She was branded, just as Marie Antoinette had been a century earlier, l'Espagnole, the Spanish woman, an outsider who had led France to catastrophe for her son's sake. What the press was mocking, loudly and cruelly, was not actually the real secret of the household. The real secret was quieter and sadder than any accusation of manipulation. Napoleon III had been dying for years, slowly, of a condition his own doctors lied to his wife about, calling it rheumatism rather than admit that surgery was too dangerous and infection nearly certain. Eugénie had spent the war not manipulating a healthy emperor into catastrophe, but propping up a visibly failing one while trying, in the only language either of them understood, to secure a future for their son. The family's response to the collapse was almost entirely private, because there was no longer a public position left to respond from. Napoleon was held in comfortable captivity in Germany. Eugénie, disguised and travelling under a false name, crossed into enemy territory to see him, staying 4 days, reconciling with him after years of quiet estrangement. From our past grandeur, nothing remains of what once separated us, she reportedly told him. Their son, meanwhile, 14 years old, having watched his father surrender an empire and an army in the space of a single afternoon, abandoned the childhood nickname Lulu entirely. From that point forward, he insisted on being called only Louis. He wanted, more than anything else in the world, a chance to prove that a Bonaparte could still win something. His mother would spend the rest of the decade, quietly, desperately, trying to give him anything except that. They settled, in the end, at a modest English estate called Camden Place, in Chislehurst, Kent. A house neither of them knew, until later, had once belonged to one of the first Napoleon Bonaparte's own mistresses. It became, improbably, the site of the happiest years of Napoleon and Eugénie's marriage. Freed of an empire to manage, the emperor's health briefly improved. They took long walks. They read together. French government spies set up watch in a nearby windmill, and the exiled couple, amused rather than alarmed, would spot the glint of a spyglass from their own drawing-room window. For Louis, exile meant something else entirely: anonymity and the sting of having missed his one chance at glory. Eugénie enrolled him at King's College in London, hoping ordinary student life, cafes, sport, the simple friction of not being watched, might settle him. It didn't. Not entirely. He excelled socially and struggled academically, restless in a way his tutors could not redirect. Sensing it, Eugénie arranged escapes instead, hunting trips, sailing on his small boat, named Le Dauphin, and eventually a symbolic pilgrimage through Italy, Spain, and Switzerland that ended at Arenenberg, the childhood home of his own father, which Eugénie had quietly repurchased, specifically so her son would have a physical thread back to the dynasty he was meant to inherit. It did not work the way she hoped. In 1873, after a long-delayed and initially successful surgery to remove a bladder stone the size of a pigeon's egg, complications set in. Napoleon III died on the 9th of January, with Eugénie kneeling beside him and their son arriving from London too late to say goodbye. 17,000 mourners attended the funeral. Eugénie herself was too shattered to attend. Crowds along the route shouted, "Instead of mourning a dead emperor, Vive Napoléon IV, long live Napoleon IV." Their 17-year-old son was, by that acclamation alone, now the last hope of an entire political movement. He enrolled at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich and thrived there in a way school had never allowed him to, finishing 7th overall in his class, first in fencing, first in riding. In 1875, he was commissioned a lieutenant in the Royal Horse Artillery. It was, by every account, the first goal he had ever achieved entirely on his own effort, rather than his name. His mother once privately confided to a friend that she wished he had been born a girl, simply so he might have been spared the burden of a soldier's ambition. He never knew she'd said it. It would not have changed a single decision he made next. The figure who unlocked the final chapter of this story was not a lover, a doctor, or an enemy. He was a British general named Frederick Thesiger, 2nd Baron Chelmsford, commander of Her Majesty's forces in the war Britain was fighting, in the first months of 1879, against the Zulu kingdom in southern Africa, a war that had almost nothing to do with France, and everything to do with what Louis needed to prove. News of a catastrophic British defeat at a place called Isandlwana reached London in January of 1879. Louis, 22 years old, and a commissioned British officer with no living memory of ever having been allowed to fight, petitioned immediately to join the reinforcements being sent south. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli refused him outright. It was only after direct, sustained pressure from two women, Louis's own mother and Queen Victoria herself, that Disraeli relented, joking wearily that he had been overruled by two determined old ladies. Louis boarded a ship on the 28th of February 1879, carrying letters of introduction from the Duke of Cambridge, hoping simply to be allowed to observe. What Chelmsford gave him instead, once he arrived, was closer to a bind than a battle. Wary of losing the last Bonaparte heir on his watch, wary of the diplomatic disaster his death would represent, Chelmsford assigned Louis to the engineering and reconnaissance staff of Colonel Richard Harrison, under the direct personal watch of a French-speaking British officer from Guernsey named Lieutenant Jahleel Brenton Carey, with explicit orders that the prince was never to move without a strong-armed escort. Louis chafed against every part of that arrangement. He had already, on one earlier patrol under Colonel Redvers Buller, exceeded his orders and nearly ridden into an ambush entirely on his own initiative. What Louis wanted from Carey, what he cost him, in the end, was not money or reputation. It was simply obedience to a headstrong prince who had spent his entire life being told, gently and constantly, to defer to his own authority as the reason rules could bend. On the evening of the 31st of May, 1879, Colonel Harrison agreed to let Louis join a small forward reconnaissance party the following morning, believing, wrongly, that the path ahead was clear of Zulu fighters. Carey would lead it, Louis would ride beside him. Neither man yet understood that the following afternoon would end with only one of them riding back to camp alive. There was only ever one child in this story, which makes the accounting shorter and no less devastating for it. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the only son of Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie, was 23 years old on the 1st of June 1879. He never married. He left no children, and with him, in the most literal sense, the direct imperial line of the House of Bonaparte ended on a riverbank in a country his family had never ruled, in a war that was not France's, fought under a flag that was not his own. What he inherited from his father was a dreamy fascination with soldiering and an inability, in the end, to imagine himself as anything less than heroic. What he inherited from his mother was the very trait that put him on that patrol in the first place, an unwillingness to accept limits placed on him by people who claimed to know better. He had spent his whole short life being told he was destined for greatness, and never once been permitted to test that greatness against real consequence, until the one time he finally was, and it killed him within the hour. There is a single documented behaviour that speaks louder than any quote he ever gave a reporter. On the morning of the reconnaissance patrol, when Lieutenant Carey suggested posting sentries and taking basic precautions at a recently occupied kraal beside the Itiotiosi River, witnesses recorded that Louis overruled him in a very authoritative manner. A prince, even in exile, even holding no actual command, still expected, and still received, deference from a British officer twice his rank in experience if not in title. That deference killed 6 men that afternoon, 2 of them ordinary troopers named Abel and Rogers, killed alongside him for no reason beyond the accident of having been assigned to his escort. The generational pattern completes itself here, plainly. Napoleon III had once ridden into artillery fire at Sedan, hoping to die with his soldiers, rather than surrender the family name's honour intact. His son, given no war of his own to inherit, went looking for exactly that same death in someone else's war instead, and found it. I told you about a gold medal and an old family seal knotted on a chain around a dead prince's neck. Here is what it means. It was the one object in his entire adult life that had never been assigned to him by ceremony, protocol, or expectation. It was simply his. It is also the last thing his mother would ever be given back of him, still warm from 23 years against his skin. At 2:30 in the afternoon on the 1st of June 1879, the small reconnaissance party, Carey, Louis, 6 troopers, and a Zulu guide, reached an abandoned kraal near where the Itiotiosi and Tombokala rivers meet. The guide warned that the enclosure showed signs of recent occupation. No one posted a sentry. Horses were unsaddled and hobbled at Louis's own insistence. A fire was lit to brew coffee. The prince sat sketching the surrounding hills, while the troopers rested in the tall grass around them. Just after 4 o'clock, roughly 40 Zulu warriors rose out of that grass and opened fire. What followed took less than a minute, and it is documented, in forensic detail, from multiple surviving accounts and the physical examination of the recovered bodies. Louis's horse, a gelding named Percy, panicked as the prince tried to mount. His right arm was crushed beneath the animal's shoulder as it reared, and he lost his grip on the stirrup leather he had been using to run alongside it. He fell. He rose. He turned to face the warriors alone, firing his revolver left-handed since his right arm no longer answered him, missing with every shot as the animal that had carried him his entire life fled without him. A Zulu warrior named Zabanga threw the first spear that found him, catching him in the thigh. Louis pulled it free and used it, briefly, as his own weapon. A second spear caught his shoulder. Weakened, bleeding from 2 wounds, he sank to the ground, and the men closing around him, among them, by name, Langalibalele, Gwabakana, and finally a warrior called Klabawathunga, finished it. The last blow was a spear thrust into his right eye, through to the brain. The fight, in total, lasted under a minute. 2 troopers, Abel and Rogers, died with him. 4 riders, including Lieutenant Carey, escaped. The financial and dynastic ledger, by comparison, mattered less than it once might have. Napoleon's estate had turned out to be modest, the old rumours of hidden imperial riches false, and Eugénie had managed what remained with real skill, auctioning half her jewellery collection for a sum that would today exceed $500 million and modernising family vineyards in Spain well enough to win a medal at the 1878 World's Fair. None of it mattered on the morning the news reached Camden Place. When the Duke of Bassano arrived at her door to tell her, Eugénie's first question was whether her son had been wounded. She saw his face before he answered. She collapsed before he had to say the word. Section 14. The Aftermath. There were no final days for Louis, in the ordinary sense a documentary usually offers. No bedside, no last words, no window to look out of. There was only a riverbank, tall grass, and a body left overnight in the open, while a stunned command structure decided, cautiously, whether it was even safe to retrieve him. Lord Chelmsford, informed of the disaster, reportedly turned white with shock. Colonel Redvers-Buller told Carey, to his face, that he deserved to be shot for having ridden away. Chelmsford declined to send a rescue force out until the following morning, when more than 1,000 men, an almost absurd overcorrection against the 6 who had ridden out the day before, were paraded at 5 o'clock to recover 3 bodies. Trooper Abel's mutilated body was found first, then Rogers, then, at last, the prince, stripped of his uniform in the Zulu custom of ritual disembowelment reserved, warriors later explained, not as desecration, but as an honour, performed only for those judged to have fought bravely enough to deserve it. His medals, sacred by that same custom, had been left untouched beside him. Around his throat, exactly where it had rested every day of his adult life, was the small gold medal of the Virgin Mary and the antique seal that had belonged to his great-uncle, the first Napoleon. It was the one object the men who stripped his body chose not to take. Surgeon Major Francis Duncan Scott conducted the examination and confirmed, in language stripped of any comfort, that the fatal blow had entered through the right eye and penetrated the brain. 17 separate wounds, all delivered to the front of his body, told their own story without needing further translation. He had not been killed running. He had been killed standing. His body was returned to England weeks later aboard a ship named, with an irony no one in 1879 seems to have remarked upon, the Enchantress. Dr. Thomas Evans, the same dentist who had once smuggled Eugénie out of a burning Paris 9 years earlier, identified the body using dental records and personally pinned Louisa's medals back onto the uniform before the casket was sealed, so that his mother, when she finally came, would not have to see what had actually been done to him. She was too broken to attend the funeral itself. She watched from a distance as 40,000 mourners lined the streets of Chislehurst, and as Queen Victoria's own sons served as pallbearers for a French prince who had died fighting someone else's war. The estate, when it was finally settled decades later at Eugénie's own death, told its own quiet story of who mattered to her at the end, her Spanish properties to her late sister Paca's grandsons, Farnborough Hill, and its collections to Prince Victor Bonaparte as her son's rightful heir, the Villa Cyrnos on the Riviera to his sister, and 100,000 francs, in a final and deliberately symbolic gesture, to the committee rebuilding the bombed cathedral at Reims. There were no surviving children of her own child to provide for. That absence is itself the final line of the ledger. The fate of the physical objects surrounding Louis's death tells its own story too. Lieutenant Carey was court-martialed for misbehaviour before the enemy, the official charge for having ridden back to safety while his prince was overwhelmed, and sentenced to be cashiered from the army entirely. British public opinion, fed by sympathetic press coverage, largely sided with him. The sentence was ultimately overturned on a technicality, and Carey was permitted to return to service, dying of natural causes some years later in India, his name attached forever, fairly or not, to a scandal he did not choose and by several credible accounts tried to prevent. Eugénie, remarkably, refused to add her voice to the chorus condemning him. When Carey faced his court-martial, she wrote in his defense, arguing that her son's death should become a reason for unity rather than punishment. Her appeal is widely credited with helping secure his reinstatement. It is one of the least remembered facts of the entire tragedy, and one of the most telling. A mother who had every reason to want a scapegoat chose, instead, forgiveness. The third and final promise of this story, the willow cutting from the island of St. Helena, where the first Napoleon had lived out his own last days in exile, was fulfilled a year later, in June of 1880, when Eugénie made a pilgrimage across the ocean to the exact spot where her son had fallen. She planted that willow there herself, alongside ivy carried from Camden Place, binding, in the most literal and physical way available to her, 3 exiled generations of one family to one small patch of African grass. Decades later, in 1996, a formal heritage route, La Route du Prince Imperial, was established across Zululand to mark the sites of his final days, a discovery, of sorts, that the story had never fully stopped being told locally, even after the world outside had largely forgotten it. For more than a century, the popular verdict on this story split neatly into 2 convenient narratives. Either Louis was a reckless boy who got himself and 2 innocent troopers killed through simple arrogance, or Eugénie was a domineering, ambitious mother who pushed her son toward death, the same way critics once claimed she had pushed her husband toward the Franco-Prussian War in the first place. Neither account survives close contact with the documentary record. What Louis was not, the fuller record makes clear, was simply reckless for recklessness's own sake. He was a young man denied, at every previous turning point of his life, the single experience every other man in his family's mythology had been permitted, the chance to prove himself under fire on his own terms. He had missed the Franco-Prussian War's real fighting as a 14-year-old bystander. He had missed his own coronation because there was no empire left to crown him into. Zululand was not recklessness. It was the only door left open to a young man who had spent his entire life being told exactly who he was supposed to become and never once shown how to actually become it. What Eugénie was not, despite a century of unkind biography, was a woman who sent her son to die for glory's sake. The documented record shows the opposite instinct at nearly every turn. Her initial support for his petition was reluctant, granted only after both she and Queen Victoria negotiated him into a desk-based, non-combat role specifically to keep him safe. Her own letters from that spring, rediscovered and more widely published in recent decades, show a woman consumed by dread rather than pride. "I expect only bad news," she confided. "Haunted," she wrote, "by the memory of him as a small boy, fearlessly climbing palace railings. What the press called meddling, history now more often calls governance. What earlier accounts called maternal indulgence, letters and staff testimony now more often reveal as maternal terror, dressed, because the century demanded it, in the language of duty. This is not a story about how an empire fell in 1870. It is a story about a mother who understood, more clearly than almost anyone around her, exactly how fragile the people she loved actually were, and who spent the last 4 decades of her life building, brick by brick, a resting place sturdy enough to hold what the world had refused to protect. Return, for a moment, to that riverbank on the 1st of June, 1879, 17 wounds, tall grass, a body left overnight because no one in command believed the danger was real until it no longer mattered. Now look again at what was still knotted around his throat when they finally found him. A small gold medal of the Virgin Mary and an old seal that had once belonged to the first Napoleon. Not a crown, not a title, the one thing in his entire scripted, ceremonial life that had simply been given to him to keep, rather than assigned to him to perform. Eugénie spent the next 41 years answering, in the only language she had left, the question this story opened with: how does the only son of an empress end up speared to death, fighting someone else's war? She never answered it with an explanation. She answered it with architecture. A church and a mausoleum at Farnborough, built in the French and Spanish Gothic style she loved, crowned with a dome modelled on the Invalides in Paris, where the first Napoleon himself is buried. Queen Victoria personally donated the white marble sarcophagi for husband and son. Eugénie reserved her own place behind the altar, between them, and waited there, in effect, for 41 more years. She outlived nearly everyone who had once mattered to that vanished world: emperors, kings, the Prussian chancellor who had engineered her husband's downfall, Queen Victoria herself. She funded field hospitals in the First World War for boys who reminded her, she admitted privately, of her own son's wasted courage. She lit candles, every year that her health allowed it, on the anniversary of the 1st of June. Her final words, spoken at 94 years old to a nephew at her bedside in Madrid, were not about an empire, or a throne, or a war. "It is time that I went on my way," she said, and died before dawn. She is buried today at Farnborough, exactly where she planned it, beside a husband who surrendered an army rather than his family's name, and a son who died proving he could have kept it. He was given everything an empire could offer a child, and none of the ordinary permission every child deserves to simply survive its own mistakes. The medal is still there. So is she,